I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So we return now to the text by Lama Tsongkhapa, the middle-length stages of the path to enlightenment. And so we're in the section on the 6 perfections. Right, those 6, like Lama Tsongkhapa said, these 6 perfections, you can encompass all the practices of a bodhisattva in these 6 practices. And so we've covered generosity, ethics, and patience of the first 3 of the 6 perfections. And which actually remember, like, actually Lama Tsongkhapa says this in the text, that those first 3 perfections are, what's the word? All bodhisattvas have to practice them, but he makes the point that, like, lay people particularly have more opportunities, like to practice those 3, right? Generosity, because monks and nuns, of course, are not supposed to have very much belongings and things like that, right? But lay people do. So, and then patience, because you're engaging in all kinds of interactions with people, right? So there's opportunities to be patient. And ethics, right? And the point he makes there is that, when you're living in the world and sort of having all kinds of interactions, then there's more temptations. Maybe that's what I say, to be unethical. Right? And it's when we're tempted to be unethical that we practice ethics, right? There's like, it's easy to be ethical if you're just like laying around alone somewhere. Like there's no, you're not, you can't really lie if you're not interacting with anybody. But when you're interacting a lot and people are, whatever, like challenging you or something, then there's opportunities to be tempted to lie, and then if you still tell the truth, that's your training in ethics, right? You're practicing ethics in a real way. And so now in the last class and this class, we left off near the end of this section on joyous effort. Right? And so remember, we went through numerous points, but I just want to go back and reread the description of joyous effort, because since we're on that section, right? So Lama Tsongkhapa says, what is joyous effort? So he says, joyous effort is explained as a mind that delights strongly for the sake of gathering virtue and working for the welfare of sentient beings, as well as the actions of your body, speech, and mind motivated by that. So it's this mind, right, that takes great joy in doing what's positive. And we have to develop that. It's not, it's a training in joyous effort, right? If we started off completely having joyous effort, then it wouldn't be one of the 6 perfections. You'd already have it, right? All the 6 perfections are something you train in. So it's training your mind to take joy and find joy in doing what's good. Right? That's the idea. Because whatever you find joy in is what you're going to do, isn't it? Like, and so if you don't learn, I said this last time, like, it's just conditions, right? Like, I was pointing that out. People find all kinds of weird things joyful, right? Like, the other day I was driving to Connecticut, and I was stopped at a rest area, and I was looking at this guy, and he had like he had bought a bottle of soda, and then he was shaking up the bottle of soda, and then he was trying to open it. Of course, it was going to explode. And I was like, wow, people find like the weirdest thing is like, he's like, somehow he liked that idea. I was like, so people can think anything is like worth doing, Anyway, so like, right, or people, I was saying this last time, but like, I was just seeing the other day, like, I turned on somebody turned on TV, and I saw that, what's that sport where they do the, like, they like scrape the ice in front of the thing and it moves?
Oh, curling.
Curling, that's it. I was watching curling, I was like, and they were so excited, and I was like, wow, they're like, I'm not putting it down, but I was just like, wow, like, people make up a sport, right, and then they find, it's like, it's just made up, right, any sport, so is baseball and football and basketball, right? We make up a sport, and then we like take huge joy in doing it, and competing at it or something. So anyway, so the idea here is that bodhisattva. So my point is that whatever you find joy in is conditioned. Does that make sense? By your childhood, by what people have told you is important, by what you think is important, right? And then when you think something is wonderful and important and great, then you put all this energy into it, right? If you think something is, and actually, whatever one person, anything that one person finds joy in, somebody else thinks is terrible. Isn't that true? Like, there's nothing that somebody else would think, oh, that's a total waste of time, right? Like, like one person could think like, getting really good grades in school is hugely important. They take great joy, and then somebody else could be like, oh man, that's like total waste, it's stupid or something, right? And somebody else could think that like, beating up a stranger is totally stupid, right? Somebody else could think it's like incredible, like, oh, I beat that person up, right? So on, right? So whatever you think is great, somebody else thinks is stupid. And so the idea here in joyous effort is that you learn to find joy in what's good, right? In helping others and in practicing the path. And I sometimes think of this one, like where sometimes people used to say to Rinpa Rinpoche, I remember this, like people would say like, when they would get really into Dharma practice, they would say, well, like, I find my joy in Dharma practice, and then people think I'm like crazy, because like everybody else like around me, like my family, they're trying to like make the most possible money, and I'm trying to like train my mind, and I'm saying that's what's exciting. And they think I'm crazy because they're like, but then you're not focusing on what we think is important. And then he said, well, that's okay. He said, like, they think you're crazy and you think they're crazy, so you're even, and it's like everybody's okay. And they can do what they do and you do what you do.
Dr. Lauren, just a thought came in. So when you say joy is always conditioned, sometimes you're predisposed to certain joys. For example, a serial killer killing a lot of people, getting joy out of it. I would not call it conditioned.
According to Buddhism, it would be conditioned by, actually, because we all are conditioned. I mean, not serial killers are an extreme example, but like, like actually, even if you look at children, like I was thinking, like so for example, like, I remember it's like watching my nephew when he was little, like immediately he liked climbing, like, and he found great joy in climbing, and no matter how tall it was, like, whereas like swimming, he was terrified, and I said, oh, come on, let's go swim, and he was like really afraid. Now he loves swimming, of course, because he learned, but the climbing somehow was natural to him. The swimming he had to learn.
Right.
So my point is that according to Buddhism, they would say that one's dispositions, whether it's extreme, like a serial killer, or whether it's just conventional, like climbing versus, they would say it's conditioned partly by your past lives, of course. So like they would say a serial killer, it's one of the 4 types of karma, is enjoying doing the action again. So whatever you predispose yourself to in past lifetimes, they say that's where the habit comes in this life naturally. So they say like some people are naturally, they like studying, for example. Other people find it very aversive, or some people naturally like learning new languages and others find it. But so, according to Buddhism, that would be one of the 4 results of past life karma. And that's why also some people like, in a negative sense, you could have like a serial killer, right? Or in the most positive sense, you could have, that's why Tibetans recognize tulkus. There's some idea that if they correctly recognize one, it's somebody who will have this natural inclination to learning, and practice. But also like musicians, like great musicians, they would say, well, of course they somebody like Mozart, of course, they would say, well, they practiced in a past life, and so they have a natural disposition to enjoy and be good at a certain thing. So that's where, so it would still be conditioned, but not by this life. If it's when you're very young, it would be conditioned by past life action. Is the karmic view of that? Does that make sense? Or is that?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. But still, it's conditioned. That's what you said.
Yeah, so it's conditioned by past life training is the idea, versus you can condition yourself in this life to do. But I remember like hearing stories. Actually, I heard a story one time, like about a positive version of that. Actually, it was a friend of mine told me this story that his teacher was like a tulku, actually, like a reincarnate lama in the same generation as Lama Tsongkhapa Rinpoche. And he said when they escaped Tibet and they were all like, they got sent to this like young lama's home. Actually, this woman Frida Bedi, a wonderful woman in India, found this place, right? So that she took many of the tulkus, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche and Lama Tsongkhapa Rinpoche, and many lamas went there. And so even compared to the other tulkus, Lama Tsongkhapa Rinpoche was so extreme. So this other tulku, like this other lama, said, like they would study all day, right? And then they would go to sleep at night. And then Lama Tsongkhapa Rinpoche had somehow gotten a little light and he was staying up all night still studying and meditating, like reading the text, and then they would like go like, oh, come on, Sopa, go to sleep already. But he wanted to keep meditating and studying. So he had such a strong imprint to find joy in that it wasn't like, oh, I have to do this. Even when everybody else was done, it was like, that was his inclination, was to keep going. But the idea is it should be a source of joy. Otherwise you want to keep doing it, right? So he had cultivated that in past lives. And then, again, I won't teach you to go over it all again, but Lama Tsongkhapa, so, Lama Tsongkhapa makes these points, right? One is he says, a couple of points I'll make. One is the obstacle to joyful effort is laziness, right? But then he goes through this point that laziness is, one version of laziness is what we usually call laziness, where you're just like wanting to lay around and not be very active and not do much. And that is a version of laziness. But one point that Buddhist psychology makes is that being busy doing meaningless things is another version of laziness. So you could like work 80 hours a week and be lazy from a Buddhist perspective. You're spiritually lazy, right? That's the idea. It's a kind of spiritual laziness. And then another kind of laziness that Lama Tsongkhapa points out, which I mentioned last time, is I would call it, they call it discouragement, I would call it like almost like the laziness of low self-esteem. Like, so the laziness of thinking, oh, I'm not capable, or I can't do it. Like, it is that rather than finding joy in doing what's good, you sort of get discouraged and just think, oh, I'm not good enough. And what Lama Tsongkhapa says here is he says, that's a kind of spiritual laziness also. And there's an antidote to it, which is recognizing, he makes various points, right? One is everybody has Buddha nature. Of course you can do it. And that even the Buddha himself, when he started out, was like you, right? So there's no difference. And that it's just causes and conditions, right? If you create the right causes, you'll achieve enlightenment. If you don't, you won't. And so and that all beings have Buddha nature, even insects will become a Buddha. So of course you can become a Buddha. You have much better opportunity than an insect and so on. And that if you train gradually, what seemed difficult before will become easy. It just takes time and gradual effort. So Lama Tsongkhapa points out, he says, so getting caught up in the feeling or idea or thought, oh, I'm not good enough or I can't do it, is another obstacle to joyous effort and is a kind of spiritual laziness that we have to overcome. It's not like, you don't think, oh, therefore I'm lazy now. Like somebody who has that habit, they could go like this. They could sometimes think, oh, I'm lazy, right? And Lama Tsongkhapa says that's laziness. And they think, oh, see, I'm hopeless. But Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, no, that's a wrong, then you can say, well, oh, I haven't applied the antidote to that kind of laziness. Now I'm even worse, right? You could stay stuck in that. And Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, don't waste your time on that, right? Like, you have Buddha nature. Make whatever little effort you can. And if you make a little effort now, then later it'll become easier to do something else. And then it'll become easier to do something else.
I think that's also like, maybe you call it like joyous effort, but it's also, I've heard it called like joyful perseverance, something like that. Or so it's almost like the word persevere. It's like, okay, so if you do something wrong, if you fail, or if you keep failing 1,000 times, that's what you're saying. Like, that's still, get back up and start over again. Persevere.
Yeah.
And, like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
Effort is another one, actually.
Yeah.
Effort.
Yeah, joyous effort and joyous effort.
So like, don't get caught up on feeling,
Yeah.
like, oh, I can't do it, or.
Right. Yeah, and such thoughts, Dalai Lama often points that out, right? Such thoughts like, oh, I can't do it, or like, getting caught up in those and sort of feeling like that's one's identity is very destructive, first of all. And also that we can all do something, and part of the idea, there's that famous story, it popped in my head when you were talking, there's that famous story there was a guy who, at the time of the Buddha, there was a guy who was very unintelligent, and so different teachers were trying to teach him, right? And they would try to teach him one verse, and then he would forget the verse. And they would try to teach him one meditation, and he would forget the meditation. And so he felt hopeless then, they felt hopeless, some of the teachers felt hopeless about him. And then then he went to the Buddha, right? And the Buddha, what was it, I can't remember the exact phrase, he said, clean out the dust, clean out the dirt, something like that. That was, he just said, and he said, just sweep and clean the shoes of the monks, and sweep up the meditation hall. And so the guy could remember that, because he could sweep, so he was sweeping, and then slowly over time he thought, well, what does the Buddha mean by clean out the dust, clean out the dirt. And he was around the Buddha enough, it started to dawn on him, and he thought, oh, he means clear out the dust and dirt of your mind. Not, I'm doing this sweeping, but it symbolizes that. He figured it out over years, like of doing it for a long time, right? Because he was just doing that repetitively, and he kept trying, and then he was like, oh, the Buddha means clean out the dust of your mind, clean out the stains of your mind. And then he thought, what does that mean? And he kept contemplating, and they say then he realized the ultimate truth in that lifetime gained realization. So he couldn't remember one line, at first. But by the end, he had gained the realization of the nature of reality, they say. And so the point being, anybody can do. In other words, we can start somewhere, right? Like that guy started. I mean, you have a better memory. Everybody here has a better memory than he started with, but he gained realization in that lifetime. So it's never hopeless. That's a fundamental tenet of Buddhism, isn't it? There's sometimes in other contexts people can feel hopeless, but in the Buddhist context, it's never hopeless. The person could actually. I thought I'll just share one more side story about this. I remember one time. It was Khyentse Rinpoche and Tashi. Some of you met Tashi. Khyentse Rinpoche is the Lama, comes to the center, one of the great lamas, and Tashi's a monk. And they went to visit this Tibetan other monk, who in New Jersey actually, who was sick, and they came back and we said, oh, how's he doing? How's the monk doing? He said, oh, and Tashi said, oh, he's doing very well, very good. And then a few days later he died. And I said, I thought you said he was doing good, really good. He said, he was. He was practicing. His mind was good. He was peaceful, and he was practicing compassion. And then I guess he died. And then he died with compassion. That's excellent. I was like, oh wow. I thought good meant he was healthy. He said no, good meant his mind was good. And I was like, oh, that's a profound teaching actually. So it's never hopeless, right? Their view was well, if you die with compassion, that's great. You're having a virtuous death. That's positive.
So it's not the ultimate goal to achieve the ultimate goal, right? It's the journey, something like that.
I guess what you say is if you can learn to find joy in doing the journey, then the goal will come naturally anyway. That's the idea. Yeah. So it's that if we focus on the goal, on the ultimate end point, right, and we sort of get discouraged. Oh, that's so far away. That's a mistake. But if you learn to enjoy the process of doing the journey, then they say by the way, the result will just happen anyway. Does that make sense? It'll come about naturally. Whereas if you focus too much on sort of how far away, and he says that if you focus on how far away the goal is, you'll get discouraged and that won't help you. Whereas if you learn if you just think, doing this journey has ultimate meaning and is actually beautiful and wonderful and joyous. And then they say bodhisattvas have this kind of joy as they're doing it, and then of course the result comes naturally as a side effect of that or something, or as a natural effect, not a side effect, but a natural effect of that.
Right, because if you get attached to the ultimate goal and you don't achieve it, then you're going to suffer.
Yeah.
I remember, I think Kalu Rinpoche or maybe I'm mistaken now, in UVA, that's about 25 years ago, he made a comment saying, if I were to tell the Buddhist path is going to be so difficult, nobody will practice it.
That's good.
That's a valid point.
Well, that leads us right to where we left off. So I'll pick up now with where we left off. So now Lama Tsongkhapa says, what are the favorite? So if you're trying to cultivate this mind of joyous effort, how do what are reliable conditions, right? He already talked about one way of cultivating it is, he went through certain points, right? Thinking of the benefits of it and the faults of not having it and so on. But now he says, he lists 4 favorable conditions for developing joyous effort. And so the first one is, he calls it the power of devotion. And he says, the power of devotion is to meditate on the causes and effects so as to aspire to discard and adopt. And I think that line can be confusing. You can say, well, what does he mean by that? But I think what he's getting at there is if you cause and effect, right, it means karma, right? So what he's saying is, if you think deeply about the nature of karma, then you'll develop a kind of devotion or enthusiasm or a commitment, maybe is a better way to put it, an inner commitment to practicing, creating, how do you say it? What to discard and what to adopt. So to adopting virtuous things and discarding non-virtuous. In other words, if you really get a sense of And I remember it's like sometimes, you know, like I'll give it. There was a metaphor for this that's often given, which is like when you see somebody who's like a, I'll call it a greedy businessman, right? Like if you look at a greedy businessman, right, that person will always be thinking like, how can I get the most profit and not lose money, right? And they'll do all kinds of things, right? And we're not saying this is good, right? This is not a good thing, but if you're greedy, it's not a good thing, but. Right, so, and even the person will like, you know, they'll be doing all kinds of things, like cutting corners and whatever, all kinds of stuff to try to make more money, right? Because they have this idea that if I'm the richest person, then I'm better off, right? Even scientific research supports this idea that that's not true, right? Like when they did scientific research on earning, they found that after a certain amount, it doesn't increase your happiness. But if that were the person's idea, right, they would think, and they would do whatever they could, right, to increase their profit and decrease their losses. So what they're getting at here, and that's because they have some idea that'll be happiness, right? So from a Buddhist perspective, what they're saying is if you contemplate karma, right, karma is the teaching actually on how to be happy and not suffer. Right? And so what they're getting at is like, if you think deeply about that, then you'll have just as much or more carefulness and joy, right? You'll have this kind of enthusiasm for doing what's good because you know it's going to lead to good results. You'll have this enthusiasm for avoiding what's bad because you know it'll cause suffering. And also then, from this point of view, from a bodhisattva's perspective, you're thinking that for yourself, but then also you're recognizing it for others, right? You're recognizing, well, if I create bad karma, first of all, I'll suffer, and secondly, it'll become an obstacle to me helping others, which is my main commitment, right? And so you start to get like, what's the word? A devotion or an enthusiasm where you want to like discard that, right? And then when you start to see the opportunities to do virtuous karma, like you get this excitement, right? Because you feel like, oh, the more I do that, then the more I can be happy, but also the more I can help others be happy. And that's the causality. And also, I think one of the point related to what you were saying about Kalu Rinpoche, or whoever that was that said that quote, is also like, if you've contemplated cause and effect, right? And what you were saying too, both of you guys comment, is like, one is, you don't worry so much about the goal because you know it's going to lead to the goal, is one point, right? In other words, if you've contemplated, well, if I practice generosity with bodhicitta, right, the result of that is Buddhahood, right? You know, if you understand the causality of it, right, cause and effect, then you don't worry, well, when am I going to become a Buddha? You just go, well, I'll just keep doing this. This process, I have devotion to the process because I see the causality of it, that it's a happy practice that leads to happy results. And also, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. So basically, you must have experienced the benefits of it, little by little.
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise,
and so the more
it's
you
very
see.
hard to build that commitment.
Yeah, but so that's the contemplation of cause and effect, right?
Right.
Where you contemplate it first from what the Buddha said about it, then you start practicing it, and as you see your own mind changing and your experience changing, you develop more and more. And they say that bodhisattvas on higher levels who have more and more experience, their devotion is a level that we're not capable of yet because we haven't had that experience, So the closer you get or the higher you go on the path, the more you've experienced of the beneficial results, and so the more confidence or devotion you have. And so they say that we can cultivate devotion, but only as you get experience, of course, your devotion becomes at a level that you weren't capable of before that because you didn't have the experience yet. Yeah. And his Holiness often points that out, right? He makes that point from the Sakya.
Yeah.
He quotes a Sakya teaching from the Lamdre, I think, that explains about that, right? That experience creates a further.
Yeah, so I mean, it's very natural. Somebody's meditating for years and don't see a result out of it. I'm sure people will be discouraged about it. What am I doing?
Right.
What am I doing? But if you see results, then you're committed towards it. The action, cause and effect, cause and effect.
Yeah. Right. And so your practice should be making you more and more joyful. Then you want to do it more, and so on. That's
Little by little, it's just a journey.
like you were saying. Yeah. And that's the point here he's getting at, though, right? Is that the more you sort of notice that process and sort of contemplate, oh wow, why am I happier now? Oh, because I'm doing this kind of action. Then you want to do that action more, right? And then as you recognize, oh, like, why am I suffering, right? Like, and then what's the word? And when you see how your own actions create your own suffering, then you want to discard those actions. And so that develops a kind of greater and greater devotion to the practice, or enthusiasm, or something like that. Then the second point he says, and this one again is important, and I'll read the line, it's just one sentence. He talks about the power of stability, and he says the power of stability is not to engage in anything haphazardly without investigating it, and having investigated it to culminate it. And what he's getting at there is something important in terms of cultivating joyous efforts, so it's worth contemplating. And what he's saying is, if you want to cultivate joyful effort, think carefully before you start something. Does that make sense? Because what you want to do, think about, it's actually a very deeply psychological process he's getting at here. You know, if you start something, if you say like, if you're like, what's the word? Fickle? Is that the word? Fickle or sort of impulsive. And you say, oh, I'm going to do this. Right? Something like Dharma practice stuff about here. But you're fickle, you're sort of fickle and you're impulsive and you say, oh, I'm going to do this. And then you start it, and then you don't really go, you do a little bit of it, and then you like, what's the word, get distracted or get like, oh, now I have to do this other thing. And then you go on to something else. And then what happens? First of all, you develop a kind of habit of not finishing things, right? Which isn't helpful. Another problem is you don't experience the result then, as we were just talking about, right? You start something, but you don't go very far, so you don't get the actual result of that thing. And then you start to feel like, well, that didn't do anything for me, I'll do this other thing. Well, now that's not doing anything, I'll do this other thing. And you never get any result, and of course then you start to feel discouraged, because then, like, and sometimes you meet people like that, where they're like, oh, I've done all these different practices, meaning parts of practices, and then they say, but nothing really happened, so like it's not working. But the reason it's not working is that they didn't do this, right? They didn't, and so what he's saying is, correct practice, to correctly cultivate joyful effort, first you actually pause and you think, okay, is this the right practice for me? Am I capable of this? Do I have the maturity or the time or the energy to really do it properly and finish it? And that you should contemplate all that and then think, this has deep meaning. Either, this is wonderful practice, but I'm not at that level yet, or it's like too hard, I have to do something more basic. Well, good, then do something more basic, right? But, so he's saying, like, if you decide this is not the right one for me yet, then you put it aside. You say, well, someday I'd like to do that. You could aspire or something, but don't start it, right? And then he's saying, pick the thing that you can do well. And actually, Khenchen Shiapa says, he says, with practices, he says, even if it's a very small practice, like, learn it well and do it well, right? And do it properly, and then you'll experience the result of it, which is a positive result. And then you can add on something else and then do that one well. And that way, he says, in that way, you'll make, you'll have positive experiences, and you'll develop, and you'll grow. So it's actually better, that's why I was giving the example of the guy who swept, right? It's better to do a really good job sweeping your meditation room. Like, whereas if all you do is set up an altar and then clean it, right? That's better, like, that's fine. That's actually good practice, right? That's actual practice, right? You clean your meditation space. And then if you're out of time, well, at least you did that well and mindfully. That was actually your meditation, right? You mindfully cleaned in order to meditate. And if you do that over and over again, then eventually you'll have time to meditate, right? And then you'll say, oh, now I'll add in 5 minutes of meditation. Sometimes Tibetan lamas will say, doing this thing though of like starting a project or a Dharma project particularly, and not finishing it creates a kind of negative karmic habit. That then, if you do that too many times, then you sort of develop this habit of not finishing things, and that's not good. And so, even if you start like, whether it's something small, like just learning a specific practice, or whether it's something bigger, like, I don't know, you take on a retreat or something. And even, that's why I'll make one more point, even like in the Tibetan tradition, they say, I remember like one time I was going to start a 3-month retreat, one time, many years ago. And they said, be clear at the beginning, I would break this retreat if, so I was like, okay, if one of my parents died, I would leave, of course I would leave. If this happened, I would leave. If I got terribly sick, or if this other person desperate, there was like a few people in my life where I was like, if they were in a real crisis, I would leave. If they were in a hospital, and they say that way you're not doing this thing, right? Whereas if you said up front, I'm going to complete this retreat unless these 5 things happen. Well, then if the ones happen, you didn't break your promise or your sort of resolve. You kept your resolve, right? They say, but then you make this resolve. If none of those things happen, then no matter what, I'm going to finish.
Did you finish?
Yeah, I finished. Yeah, none of those bad things happened. So it was easy. I was really glad none of those happened. But you get the idea of this, right? So the idea is like you be clear up front. I'm only going to start. I'm only going to start if it's the right thing to do, and if I'm, and then you have to check yourself also, like, so like, because sometimes in the West we have the mistake of also we jump to the most advanced. Some people do like so, like so you would say, oh, I'm going to do like the whatever this very advanced practice or something, and again that's a mistake, right? We should start with the more basic levels of practice and then build up, and then we'll be able to do them correctly. So that's the, and you see how that leads to the joyous effort, where it also leads to confidence, right? Whereas if you start something and you finish it, like so let's say you say, okay, I'm going to do this practice for a month, and you do it for a month, it develops also your confidence, right? Like, oh, I resolved to do that, and I did it. Now I can do something else, and I can finish that. And you develop a kind of confidence in yourself. Whereas if you start things and you don't finish them, it actually undermines your confidence, right? You start to feel like, well, I don't know, and I say I'm going to do, like, it's just like somebody else. If 5 times if like, let's say 10 times, if you have a friend, and 10 times they say, oh, I'm going to do this with you, and they didn't show up, or they didn't finish, or they didn't do what they said, you're not going to trust them, right? Well, if you do that to yourself, you're not going to trust yourself. Does that make sense? And there'll come a point, if you keep doing that, where, even when you say, oh, I'm going to do such and such, you know in the back of your mind, oh, I probably won't do it. That's a very bad habit. And so here the idea is the opposite, right? If you say, like, so like that feeling you have with somebody else, like, think about that. If you know somebody where they say, whenever they say they'll do something, they always do it. I can totally rely on them, right? And you have the feeling of trust. You want to have that feeling towards yourself, too. Does that make sense? And that's part of this. Then the next one I think is wonderful, this one. This is the third of the 4. So he said, and I'll just read the one sentence. He says, this is called the power of joy. And he says, the power of joy makes your undertaking of joyous effort uninterrupted and insatiable, like a child engaged in play. So that's how, and I think this is beautiful. He's describing this is how ideally you should be feeling. This is what you would cultivate, the attitude you would cultivate in reference to Dharma practice, right? Like a child at play, right? And like what he's getting at there is, like, nowadays it would probably be, it could be outside playing, but more often I guess that is probably video games, right? But like when a parent says to their child, like, turn off the game, like they're on their Xbox or Wii or whatever, right? And the parent says, turn off the game, and the child's like, 5 more minutes, please, like, I really want to finish this game. I'm at the 14th level and I have to get to the 15th level, right? And like the parent's like, well, it's bedtime. All right, 5 minutes. I'm setting the timer, and then like, right? And it's like the kid wants every extra second to do that thing, right? Because it's so fun to them, right? And what he's getting at is that should be our attitude, right? Insatiable and uninterrupted, right? Like, and like, sometimes you see kids like that, right? Where it's like, oh, but if only, like, even 5 minutes is so, and like, can I get up early on Saturday to have extra time, or something, right? There's like this great enthusiasm, right? And joy in doing that thing. And what he's saying here is that's the attitude to cultivate in regards to Dharma practice. And so check for yourself, right? Like, first of all, is that your attitude towards your own meditation practice and so on? And if not, what would make it that way? Does that make sense? And part of the point is like, if you, part of this, I guess, is like, if you're feeling like it's a chore, then you're doing it wrong, right? That's what he's implying here. And there are various ways we could do that, right? Like sometimes whatever, like you set it up in a way where it's overly rigid, or you try to do too much at once, or you try to do the wrong practice that's not your right level, right? Or whatever, like you set it up in the wrong way, and then of course you're not going to feel that. And so the implication here is set it up so it feels that way. And they even say that, like, they give examples with meditation, which we'll get to in the next section actually, where they say, when you're cultivating like meditative concentration, do a really short session and then stop. When you want to continue, even while you still want to continue, stop. And then you'll get up and go do something else, but you want to go back and do more. And it's like being skillful to cultivate this kind of habit of this kind of enthusiasm, for the practices. And like one other point, like, again, sometimes people just, I guess, do it out of like some rigidity or something, but a lot of times you'll read of Tibetan tradition of people who did like, like, for example, their Nundro, right? All these different 100,000 this and 100,000 that, and then like after that they, sometimes you're like you'll read, and then the person decide, oh, I want to do another 100,000, like especially like Tibetan lamas, oh, and then I did another 100,000 of this and that, and then they did a retreat of 100,000 this, and you'll think like, well, that sounds exhausting or something, right? Like you might think that if you read it, like, oh, millions of this, like, like Lama Tsongkhapa did like, what was it? I think instead of, usually they do 100,000 prostrations as a tradition of Tibetan lamas. I think he did like 3.5 million.
Mm-hmm.
And you might think, oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. But like, the point is he must have had this attitude, right? Like, it's just fun. Like, you know, he could have stopped at 100,000. He was allowed to. He didn't have to do any if he didn't want. But right. But for him, it was like he was having so much fun. Like, why would I stop? You know, like you get the feeling like he didn't do it to like torture himself, right? Any more than those kids are doing weed to torture themselves, right? Like they're doing it because that's what they think is the most fun thing, right? So you cultivate this mind of joyous effort where it's like, what else would I want to do? That's the fun thing to do. Everything else is like, the other stuff I have to do is like a distraction. But then when I can get back to that, it's like, oh wow, I get to do this fun. Like now I get to have fun.
Dr. Lawrence, so especially in Nepal, you see a lot of these Tibetans doing the prostration. Like they would go, not just in front of the temple, they would start right stupa. They would start way before that and keep on doing that. And then
So they prostrate all the way there.
Prostrate all the way down. And then there's a place called Mount Kailas where you're supposed to prostrate and uphill and go all the way to Mount Kailas. And that's another practice. Well, coming back to the subject, it's just a ritual to change your mind. That's my belief system. It could be attained in several ways. Doesn't necessarily need to be a prostration.
I was just giving that as an example. Yeah, it could be.
Would that be a right take, like in terms of thought? Because all you're trying to do is build devotion, faith, unwavering commitment, and then there might be other aspects of reciting mantras and stuff.
Yeah, whatever it would be. I guess one point I would make is like if there was for the person themselves. Like I'm going back to the point about engaged in play. Like, so in other words, if I were like, I'll give an example. If I were to look at prostrations and think, oh, like that seems really hard, and I don't want to do it. Well, then I shouldn't be doing 100,000. It'd be stupid to say I'm going to do 100,000 something I don't want to do, because then I'm just going to be upset. So that would be the wrong thing. And that would be for someone like Lama Tsongkhapa who found great joy in doing it. But I'll give an example of this one. Like, part of this would be, I'll just give like a practical example, right? So let's say somebody comes home from work, right, and they're tired. And then, like, actually, if you're going to cultivate this, you would actually think, like, well, what would be that for me, right? And I sometimes think, like, I think of this example that Lama Tsongkhapa once gave, where he says, a person who just lays down on the couch, like lays there like that, right? Mm-hmm. And then just thinks of love for all beings, and that's their way of relaxing, right? And they're not saying any mantra, and they're not doing any prostration. They're just thinking of like love for all beings, and they're like, okay, that's what I'm going to do to relax after work, right? And he said, good. That's what he said. Like he made this point. He said that's perfect practice. Like they don't have to say a mantra, they don't have to do some other thing, like, but that's Dharma practice, right? Because they're thinking of love for all beings. Like, so the point is like, what would be that for me? You have to ask, like, what would give me this feeling of, oh, okay, that would be like relaxing, or that'd be fun, or that'd be what I feel like doing now. And don't do something that's torturing yourself, or you won't want to keep doing it, and then what's the point?
Right. Well, His Holiness basically on seven limbs, he says the prostration is for cutting down on pride, quote unquote. That's his statement.
So still though, I'm trying to connect like, so where does the joy come from? So does it come from one, I guess, like thinking about advantages and disadvantages of virtue and non-virtue, cause of, where does the joy, and I understand like what it is, like joyful effort, what it is, be enthusiastic about your practice, but I'm still trying to be like, so what is the joy comes from, is it something that arises naturally from, I don't know, from virtue? Is that a cause from virtue's actions, or?
What I think the main the way Lama Tsongkhapa presents it here. That's why I was giving the example of like the person, like I think the main, I guess I would say, I think there are two parts. Like one is, there is a natural thing, right? Like there is at a certain point, let's say with, for example, in cultivating meditation, right? There's a natural point where meditation gives rise to a kind of bliss and lightness, or pliability, or flexibility of the body and mind, that progresses as one goes higher through the 9 levels of concentration, which we'll get to. And so I think at a certain point, when one starts to have those kind of experiences, then there is a natural side effect of joy, right? Like, so there is so getting to your point, Gabe, one of the causes of joy as one progresses, is the practice itself sort of has a side effect, you could say, of a kind of bliss and joy that's physical and mental, and that helps one to have this joyful effort. But what Lama Tsongkhapa here is pointing out is mainly the cognitive, is the thinking. So is what you were saying. So there's that the main cause of joy here is, let's just say that right, is thinking, and at first you think it and then you feel it, right? It starts with cognition, and then again, eventually the thoughts give rise to a feeling of like joy and enthusiasm, because you understand the benefits, you know, and the losses, the loss of not doing it and the benefits of doing it. And I think that's why I've been bringing up these examples in our culture, is like, it's hard to relate to that unless you recognize, well, everything I ordinarily have joy for is just because of that anyway. Does that make sense? Like, so in other words, when people, like, you know, so like, actually, I'll ask this, like, I didn't actually, I saw only a headline, I didn't actually read the story, but like, there was some story recently, right, like in Philadelphia, wasn't there like people were crazy, right, until after the Super Bowl, what happened?
Yeah.
I missed
riots
the,
or something?
there were like riots, like people were so excited, right, that they were like, they were knocking down poles, they were like so, and like, so if you pause, right, like why were they that excited, like there was, like they didn't personally win the game, right, they didn't get a bonus of $1 million, they didn't like, whereas it was just, like, they had some idea, right, they had some idea, this is my team, right, and if my team wins, that's so wonderful. Like, and then, like, they're part of a group of people who think, oh, that's wonderful. And then they have some thought, right? Like, if we lose, that's bad, and if we win, that's good, and that, like, has all these incredible benefits, which, of course, is no real benefit, actually. It's not like nobody's being liberated from suffering, nobody's being healed of an illness, nobody's being freed from poverty, it's just a game, right? But, like, they were knocking down poles, right? They were so excited or something. So the idea here is similar. I was just using that as a worldly example. So the point is like, it's just thoughts, right? But then those thoughts lead to overwhelming feelings in some cases, where people will do criminal things even, right? Like, you know, out of excitement because they thought this is meaningful. So here, what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is, he's giving, so one is what you said, the joy of just the practice itself, but he's getting another point here, which is, you know, so you would think, like, with great sort of, what's the word? It's almost like if you're in the culture of bodhisattvas, I'll put it that way. If you're in the culture of bodhisattvas, then there's this like, the cognition or the thought process is like, so the person would, I'll use the example of like seeing emptiness directly. That's it, right? It's like bodhisattvas who have not seen emptiness directly, right? When they're contemplating that, they're like going like, and if you read like the text of Maitreya, it's clearly in there. There's this like quality like this, where it's like, what are the benefits of that, right? Like, well, somebody who's seen emptiness directly, first of all, you've never seen reality until you've seen emptiness directly, right? Your whole existence, from beginningless time, you've never seen what's actually true. You're always seeing your projections about things, right? And like, to finally see reality when all you've ever seen is projections is amazing, right? Then also, at that level, like, so they would be thinking this, right? Then the bodhisattva would think, also, like, until I see emptiness directly, I'm always thrown by my own karma and delusions from life to life, right? And I have no control of my own rebirth. So every time I die, whatever karma I create just throws me somewhere. Once I've seen emptiness directly, that no longer happens. I no longer take rebirth through the power of karma and delusions. I'll be able to direct my rebirth. You know, like a toku can, like a true toku, not just a label. Then I can benefit others so much more extensively, right? Like, in other words, if I can control where I take rebirth, then I can go places to continue my practice from life to life, and my process of becoming a Buddha will become so much faster, right? And then also, if I've seen reality, I can benefit others so much. Like now I can just benefit others a little bit through some study, you know, but when I've seen emptiness directly, I have the realization, right? And through that realization, when I go to benefit others, it'll be so much more profound. Like, so my ability, and then they might think, you know, like think of your own mom or dad or siblings, right? You think, well, even though I love them, actually I can't help them that much right now. Like, I mean, literally, in our life right now, right? Like, if I wanted to lead them to enlightenment, I can't lead them to enlightenment, right? Like, but if I've seen emptiness directly, I can have so much benefit for them. I could actually help them more. You know, and the bodhisattvas would, and then like not just them, but countless others, right? And then I'll be so much closer to Buddhahood at that point. You know, and then also Buddhahood I'll become irreversible at a certain point from Buddhahood. You know, so if they keep thinking that, then they think that's all that matters. All that matters is realizing that. You know, eventually they would get this feeling, right? And like where the bodhisattvas would be looking at each other going, yeah, we want to study and contemplate and meditate on that but the idea is like they get such enthusiasm and joy because they see incredible benefit in it. So that's a big part of it. And they become like, what's the word? So all these kind of qualities of like, well then if they're creating the cause of that, right? Like, so they're going to go study the Majjhimaka, Majjhimaka Avatara, right? Which is said to be one of the finest texts on emptiness. You know, they would have an unbelievable enthusiasm for that, right? Because it's like, well, studying that text, then you meditate on it, and that's how you realize emptiness directly, right? Like Chandrakirti himself did, and so on. And the great masters of Tibet all said, like, you know, that studying and meditating on that helps them to realize emptiness directly, right? So then they would have this like, incredible enthusiasm for studying that because they recognize, oh, this is creating a cause that will lead to a result of that result, which then will lead to so much benefit for me and for countless others. Like, you know, so they would reach a point where they would feel like, oh yeah, I would knock down a pole to do that. Like I would, you know, so to speak. That's what's exciting, you know, is my point. Like, yeah, because it's all labels, isn't it? Like, it's weird. Like, you know, I'll give one more example. Like, just to make one more. I'm trying to give like conventional and then the Dharma example, right? Like, if you were, you know, like people sit around at a table, right? Like around, and I'm talking about normal Western society. Like if people sit around at a table, and then like if they talk about something like, oh, this is like the best, awesome, like so it might be like and actually whatever you're around, actually it's really true, isn't it? Whatever you're around and you hear people like with great enthusiasm talking about the benefits of, then eventually like if you trust those people and you like them, then eventually you want that, isn't it? Like, so in other words, like I heard this like many years ago. I was in LA at a table, and like I was at a friend was going to get married, and like so I was in LA for his wedding, and I was with one of the groomsmen, like you call it, and like everybody, all the other guys at the table were like LA and richer than me, and they all had like iPhones, you know, and I was like, and they were all like looking at their iPhone, and I thought, oh, this is terrible. Like a dinner party. I mean, not the dinner party was nice, but the part where everybody had their iPhones out, I was going like, you know, we're all hanging out. Why are they all looking at their phone? You know, but then they were like, oh, this phone's so great. Blah, blah. You know, now I have like an iPhone. You know, everybody's like, you know, because I was like, well, you know, like the cool people, you know, the cool guys in Los Angeles. You know, but mine's a 5, so it's really bad. So it's true. But my point is like, you know, or like somebody, or like if somebody's like with a group of people and everybody says, oh, like the coolest place to go on vacation is like here. Oh, you got to go there. It's like so awesome. And if you hear it over and over again, like they say, oh, this is good about it and that's good about it, then eventually the thought starts to come in your mind. Well, wow, what would it be like to go there? You know, like maybe that would be good. You know, or like even like kids in school, right? Like if kids go to school and everybody says like, oh, like you don't have these kind of sneakers. You're wearing those? Like, you don't have, what's the newest one? I don't know what the new ones are. I'm sure Jordans are like ancient now, so whatever's new. Like, you know, like then eventually the child like thinks like, I gotta get those. You know, and then like, and even like kids will get a job, right? They'll like be like, if their parents say I won't pay for it, right? They might be like, all right, I'll do chores, or I'll, like, you know, I want that so much, like I'll deliver papers, whatever it would be, right? Like, because I really want those because they're so, but so I'm saying whether you're a child or an adult, right? Like adults are the same way though, right? Like, if you were part of a group and everybody says, oh, we go to this place for vacation, right? And then like you would start saving up money, thinking, I want to go there. So the idea is like whatever you hear has like benefit. If you think like, and then somehow if you become somewhat convinced of that, you develop an enthusiasm for it, or a kind of joy, yeah.
So what's the difference between that and like attachment? Like, 'cause that could be, because you're getting into examples that it makes me think of like, well, I mean, you can get crazy about like, you know, material stuff or with the world, but that sounds like attachment to me, like desire or craving or something like that. But
one difference, though, I think that eventually comes as one goes further in the practice, I think, is that with attachment, the problem with attachment, or actually the main problem with attachment, is that there's an exaggeration going on, right? Like so, whereas when you have attachment, like a worldly attachment, because actually, you know, they make a point. Not all desire, from a Buddhist perspective, not all desire is bad, right? But like the idea is that a desire where you're exaggerating the qualities of the object is a problem, right? So in other words, if like a person thinks, you know, so like when the person thinks, oh, going to this place on vacation will be so happy, right? Like, you know, and then like, sorry, like, and then they go there and like, what's the word? They're on the cruise ship and everybody has the flu. What's that called? They get like the illness, or you know, then like, whereas you don't know, it's not reliable. Is the point, right? Like, or even you go and of course it's just a week of doing some activity, whatever it would be, right? But like the idea here is like, so the seeing emptiness directly point is actually, if anything, it's not exaggerating the object, it's that we don't even fully appreciate. Even if we understand as much benefits as are explained in texts, they say when you actually experience that, the freedom you experience and the bliss, the joy you experience is more than you could have imagined, not less. So part of it is that like, is not an exaggeration. That's the difference. Like with attachment of like saying, oh, if I get these sneakers, right, then it'll be happy. Of course, is that it doesn't lead to pure happiness. That's the problem. Whereas with the Dharma happiness that you're aspiring to in this sense, or desiring, it's a healthy desire because it's realistic, and it's not exaggerating. It's actually a correct assessment. Which of course you can, I mean, that's what Buddhism would say. You have to check for yourself and practice, but that would be from a Buddhist perspective, I think that's the difference, is that the result in happiness is actually, what's the word? It lives up to its hype. like that's funny. You know, and I think that's the main difference. That's my view.
It's like more, the way I perceive it is like, if you were to hit calm abiding in some way or fashion, not the ninth level, some way, you don't have laxity, you don't have excitement, and so when you don't have either of those, then you have joyfulness left there in between, and it's more of a, not feeling, a direct feeling, but an indirect feeling as opposed to direct feeling. It happens such that you don't strive for it, it just erupts along.
I remember once I was talking to a monk, actually, like a Western monk who I'd heard had achieved a very high level of calm abiding. But I was chatting with him. I was saying like he'd been a monk for many years, and I was pointing out I was very open, honestly. We were friendly, and so I said, you know, most of the men in particular who became monks, like Western men who became monks, disrobed. They stopped being monks. They went off and got married. You know, it's just the truth. I said there are only a few who, like you, are still monks. And I said, well, how come, you know, like they were smart guys too. How come you were able to? And he said, he was honest, also back, and he said, you know, even, you don't have to achieve the ninth level. He said, just when you get to like the sixth level even of calm abiding, the bliss and the pleasure of that meditative experience is more than any worldly pleasure.
Right.
He said, so then it's no longer, he said, if you haven't achieved that, then sometimes there's some feeling of discouragement or of like, he said, once you've achieved that, then the idea of like, oh, to have, whether it be a partner or more money or good meal, you know, better food, or he's like, well, what, once you've achieved even that level, it's not, that's more pleasurable actually. So just on a simple level, who wants,
Right.
you know, who's going to take a less, you know, who's going to give up like, you know, say like, you know, if they have something great in their hand, give it up for something less. Like, that'd be stupid. So it's exactly what.
And then actually that joyfulness remains with you, it just comes back post-meditative.
And it's always available all the time, not like, you know,
It's beautiful.
and then the fourth of the four is he calls it the power of suspension. Again, I'll read it. The power of suspension is to rest your body and your mind when they're worn out due to your joyous effort. As soon as you've recovered, you start again. Right. So what he's getting at there is part of cultivating joyous effort is knowing when to rest. Does that make sense? So that you have to have balance, right? And you know when to take a break and then come back to doing those things. So you know, it was weird. It's like burnout prevention. you don't burn yourself out. And in the commentary, I guess it's related maybe to the next paragraph, but in the commentary also, one Lama who was commenting on this pointed out, he said, also, taking care of your body. He made a point about joyous effort. He said also taking care of your body by eating healthily and exercising are part of that. And then he said also, he made the point, spending time with other people who have joyous effort helps us cultivate joyous effort. And avoiding people who, or not avoiding necessarily, but not spending as much time with, let's put it that way. In other words, not immersing ourselves in groups of people where their main interest is the opposite of that. Because he made the point, he said, so part of cultivating, in other words, if you're around people who have enthusiasm and joy and virtuous things, that reinforces your own effort to cultivate that. Whereas if you spend most of your time, or a lot of time around people who are saying like, oh, that's a waste of time, and what matters is this, and then that undermines your own effort. So he says, if you're trying to be skillful in cultivating joyous effort, to the extent that you can, be around other people who are also doing that, and it'll support your effort, and it'll help you progress in that way. And then Lama Tsongkhapa says, in this way, in dependence on stopping adverse conditions, right, to joyous effort, and relying on favorable conditions to joyous effort, you should undertake joyous effort until your body and your mind become light, like a piece of cotton carried by the wind. Isn't that a beautiful description? Right? So he's saying again though, what he's getting at here is, you don't get to joyous effort by forcing, like, what's the word? Like, by going, I'm going to have joyous effort. Right? He's saying you eliminate the unconducive states, you create conducive conditions by doing all these things, right? Thinking carefully before you start something, bringing it to a conclusion, being around other people who are practicing joyous effort, cultivating that kind of sense of play, and so on. And if you do that, then eventually your body will be light like a piece of cotton in the wind, which is a beautiful description. And of course, then all the virtuous practice will be easy. Right? So he says, and then he makes the last point about joyous effort, where he says, when you train in joyous effort, you should make it possess all the 6 perfections. Abiding in joyous effort yourself and establishing others in joyous effort is the generosity, and so on. So what he's saying there is like, in other words, that in each of the perfections, he says, ideally you would integrate it with the other perfections, right? So what he's saying is, if you're setting a good role model for others of joyous effort, and you're encouraging them to practice joyous effort too, that's generosity in relation to joyous effort, right? If you're ethical in your practice of joyous effort, right? So you do it in a way that's ethical and moral, that's the morality of joyous effort. As you're practicing joyous effort, there will be obstacles, right? And difficulties that arise, just part of normal life. And when you are patient in relation to those obstacles and continue working with joyous effort, that's the patience of joyous effort, right? And then, when you concentrate on your effort at making joy, and your practice at joyous effort, when you sit down and meditate and think, the reasons for joyous effort are this, and the reasons to not have joyous effort are that, right? And, and you meditate on what he was teaching here, that's the concentration of joyous effort. And the wisdom of joyous effort, of course, is recognizing the emptiness of the 3 spheres, right? So recognizing that, actually that those three things, right? So joyous effort itself, the person cultivating joyous effort, and the cultivation, right? Those 3 things. So the cultivation are all mutually dependent, right? They're interdependent, and therefore they don't exist independently, right? So they're empty of independent existence. That's the wisdom of joyous effort. Understanding that they lack independence. Independent status is a kind of wisdom. That's the wisdom of joyous effort, right? It's wisdom of understanding the emptiness of joyous effort in that sense. Not the emptiness in the sense it doesn't exist. Of course it exists, but it doesn't exist independently, and that's the wisdom. So, any questions about joyous effort, or comments about joyous effort?
Is that the same for all 6?
The emptiness of the 3 spheres, you mean, or the 6, or integrating all 6 into the.
Right.
Yeah, but so he teaches that in all 6. In all the 6 perfections, he says integrate them with the other perfections, and the wisdom version is always about the emptiness of the 3 spheres. Yeah, and he says if you can integrate all the 6 perfections with the other perfections, they'll become stronger and more firm. That's the idea. So if you could, to the extent that you can sort of, he makes these points. One is they'll become more firm, and another point is like, otherwise also, if you don't do that, then he gives the example early on in the text about generosity, where he says, if you're practicing generosity, for example, but then you stop being ethical, you know, like, so let's say the person wants to be very generous, but then they start stealing in order to be generous, or lying in order to be generous, so they're not ethical anymore, that it also, you know, they have a bad result. And there's just not, you're missing an essential part of generosity, which is it should be integrated with ethics and so on. So in that sense, it's important to integrate them in all the cases, to the extent, you know, we won't be perfect, but like, you know, same thing, like if you're being generous, but then you start getting angry at the people you're generous to because they don't appreciate, well, that even the generosity itself doesn't have much, you know, they're not going to appreciate your effort to be generous once you're treating them angrily, and your own karma will be harmed because of your anger. So he's saying, I'm just giving examples. So in each case, he's saying, if you integrate them, one is they become more firm, but the other is then you don't undermine your practice, you know, because, and part of that also, I guess the implication of that too, is that we should be careful not to so emphasize one perfection that it causes us to lose the other perfections, right? Giving that example, like, so, and there's, like, ethics is very important, right? But if you start to become so rigid with your ethics that you start becoming angry at everybody who's not as ethical as you, that's a big problem, right? And then it's sort of missing the point. So in that way also we have to integrate the 6 perfections so that they're balanced, right? So that, you know, so for example, if you're cultivating ethics, you do it in a way that doesn't undermine you being a patient person, and so on. Because otherwise it's sort of, you're missing the main point, really. Not of ethics, but of the training in general, right? Which is to train your mind to more positive states. Yeah, so it really is important to integrate all 6 together.
So, so basically, I mean, one of the things I get from this section is like, so whenever you feel like, you know, for example, just you're about to do a Dharma practice or any virtuous action or anything like that, if you feel like it feels like a chore or something like that, then that's kind of like a sign that you need to sort of like look at the benefits, like go back and reevaluate the benefits of what you're doing, things like that, or?
Yeah, I want to, just, this is my personal view on that, like, so, my personal input, whatever, is like, so like, let's say you're starting to do a Dharma practice and you feel like it's a chore, like giving your example, right? What I suggest is to stop then, just actually, because Lama Tsongkhapa would say this, stop and ask yourself, why am I doing this? You know, like, what's the reason? You know, like, and then to actually contemplate that for a long, you know, as long as it takes, and like, I've seen this sometimes with Lama Tsongkhapa. I'll just give an example, like where, it's like, let's say it right, you know, so like, let's say there's going to be some practice, right? And then like, I think actually, this is my, like, so, I'll just say this way. So let's say you're going to do a practice, right? And the practice would usually take half an hour, but you're feeling like it's a chore, right? To actually stop and say, well, why am I doing it then? Right? Like, what's the reason? And actually, that's the more important question, you know. And sometimes, this is my point, Lama Tsongkhapa sometimes will spend, you know, the half hour, you might spend 27 minutes on why. You know, until he gets to the great enthusiasm and the real meaning, and then spend 3 minutes on the practice. That's better than spending a half hour, you know, like if you have a half hour of practice, right? But if you were going to do just the, like, if you were going to think, well, don't really, like, what's the word? Oh, I don't really want to do it, it feels like a chore, I'm just going to say the words of this practice or something, like, Shantideva even says, in his Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, he says that, if you do it without concentration and without bodhicitta, there's no benefit anyway, right? So he would say, there's no meaning to that practice then, in a sense. Like, in other words, if the person's just feeling like, oh, it's a chore and I'm going through the motions because you know, if your answer were just like, well, I told my teacher once I would do this, so I'm doing it because I promised. But you're not really concentrating, and you're not having bodhicitta motivation, there's not much meaning. I mean, I guess there's minimal meaning that you're not breaking your promise, that's something, but if that's the only meaning, that's not very much, right? But so the teaching here would be stop and ask yourself, why am I doing this, right? And then when you come to a deep understanding that the real meaning, if it's a Mahayana Dharma practice, the real purpose is bodhicitta, right? And so if you get in touch with how does this practice relate to bodhicitta, does that make sense? And why am I doing it in relation to the bodhicitta? And then if you come to some clear inner, oh wow, that's why I'm doing it. Like, it's going to be a benefit in this way and that way. Like, it's going to help me practice the path and achieve enlightenment and benefit others and so on. And if you develop that enthusiasm, then it's better to spend less time on the practice but do it with that mind than to spend more time on the practice with just like going through the motions. I think that's Yeah, I've seen that with, like, even like sometimes people come for like a big initiation in Lama Tsongkhapa, right? And it's like they have like, say, 5 hours for the initiation. I've been to things like that with Lama Tsongkhapa, right? Where he spends like, you know, and like actually, you know, then you go, it's like there's 4 hours and 4.5 hours in, and he's been doing like this question: why are you here? What's the motivation? You know, and then you go and like one time when it was Greece Wedding Center, I'm like, we only rented the hall for this long. How am I gonna? What, do I have to talk to the place and how? You know, and then like. But it's like once you get to the right motivation, right? Then Rinpoche went very fast through the whole. Usually we take like a 4 hour. He did it like a half hour, but the point was, right, that people were getting in the right motivation and the right state for doing it, and then he could go very fast through the practice. That was his point. I think there was an implicit point related to what we're talking about, which is, you know, the motivation is more important, is the most important, and the actual practice then has to be done correctly. But it could be it should be an expression of bodhicitta. Is the point. You know, otherwise, it's not. Doesn't have much meaning.
Yeah, because I mean, it's easy to kind of like fall into that, you know, busyness of life and stuff like that, and you just kind of lose that, you know, even if it's subtle,
Yeah.
you lose the, even if you have like develop a little like a quick motivation or a quick, you know, like let's develop a motivation for this, but you're losing the sort of like underlying also. You're not joyful about it. You're just doing it because, you know, but it goes away, like it fades away, and it's not strong, I guess.
Yeah, and so we have to get back. The most important thing is getting back to that. Yeah, that's what I think the implication is.
Yeah, even at the start of the meditation, when we do 4 imaginables and taking bodhicitta refuse and stuff like that, I mean, you just sound the word. You're not even into the words most of the times. You know? It makes sense to actually pause and mean it
Yeah.
when you're doing those simple things.
Right.
I mean, do you always have to have that, you know, kid-like, you know, like enthusiasm to do stuff, or is it like sometimes? I think it's, you know, that's the difference between kind of like a child and an adult. You know, an adult knows like, hey, I'm gonna do this because of this and this reason. And it's like sometimes, I don't want to say force yourself, but you do it. You know what I'm saying? As a kid, you're like, nah, I don't want to do that. You know what I'm saying?
I get what you're saying, and I guess one point is like, you know, I mean, the way Lama Tsongkhapa is presenting it, I mean, that idea of the power of joy, which uninterrupted, like a child engaged in play, and part of I think what he's getting at there is like, you know, first of all, I mean, like it's connected to what you were saying, Gabe. I think, what did I say, right? Like, you know, we're not all going to always be like that, of course. Like that's an ideal state, you know. But I think what he's describing is the ideal state. So what he's getting at is like, let's just say this right. You know, it's like the difference. I'll give an example. Like it's like the difference between like say an adult who has a job, you know, that they're doing because they have to pay the rent or something, right? They have to pay their mortgage or something, you know, and that's okay. I mean, like, and it's better than being homeless, for example, or something, you know. So it's not there, but the idea is that, but part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at here, you know, the implication, I mean, a metaphor or something would be like, you know, where you eventually want to have though the job where it's like, oh, I would do that even if I wasn't getting paid. Like, I'm so happy to go to work, you know, like, what's that?
Ideally.
Yeah, ideally, and so the ideal is to be the adult like that, you know. But in other words, there's a recognition, of course, that it's not always like that. Yeah, but the idea is like, so with regards to Dharma practice, to have that kind of attitude. It's not like where eventually it's like, you know. So we may have at times the feeling of, okay, well, I just have to do this, and you know, like, but we want to cultivate eventually a kind of a state like Lama Tsongkhapa was describing, where it's like, metaphorically speaking, it's like the person who's like, well, I'd go to that, you know, like. Something you talk right? Somebody says that, like, oh, I have this job where, like, yeah, I'd do that if I wasn't, you know, like it's so fun to go in. I would do that if I, you know, if they weren't paying me anything, I'd go. So the metaphor there would be like that. Does it make sense? Like, eventually to have the attitude towards Dharma practice, or to eventually get to that place where it's like, it feels, yeah, like the child at play kind of thing. That, you know, where it feels natural in that sense. But there's a recognition it's not always like that, of course.
It's my first time here, and this is very helpful. I'm having a lot of reflections here as I sit here. I'm thinking of, it felt like right now is I'm trying to find the distinction between the joyous effort and addiction. I mean, I'm addicted to my job.
Mhm.
And sitting here, I realize it's because it's my joyous effort. I find happiness doing it. It's crazy. My family thinks I'm crazy for working all the time, but now I realize it's because it pleased me. I find so much joy in it.
Hmm.
But then, where is the line between this joyous feeling that I derive from being addicted? The landmark of addiction is basically finding so much joy in that particular addiction that you're going through. So, I mean, it's a reflection.
It's an interesting question. At one point I'll make, I mean, of course, that's not, I mean, Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't directly address that here, but one point, it's an interesting question, like, there's one thing let's say this right, like, one point that's sometimes made more, not in the Buddhist context so much as, but in the word addiction, addressing that word, it's interesting, because sometimes there's, like you'll see where people, in the literature on that, right, I mean, people will debate, well, at what point is something an addiction? And part of the definition has to be that it's causing significant suffering for oneself or others, right? And so, so I think that's a distinguishing point. It's like, whereas if somebody is enjoying something, even if somebody spends humongous amounts of time doing something, right? If it's not causing suffering, and actually even in psychological literature, they say, they usually have a list. They'll say, is it causing significant, what's the word? Like, they don't use the word suffering, they use a different word, but it's the same point. Like, so is it causing significant impairment or something like that?
Imbalance.
In the person's career or family life or health or something. So that's part of the definition. So like if somebody said, well, is this an addiction or not? It's a fair question, right? And so part of the question would be, well, or is it like, so I don't, like if the person were working so much that then their doctor were saying, hey, this is not good for your health, and they kept doing it, right? Or if their partner says, I'm divorcing you now, I can't take it anymore, you're never home, and the person said, well, I have to go back to work. Well, I mean, then of course they're causing, I mean, the one example, they're harming their health, right? The doctor said, look, you're gonna have, there are people like that, right? Where somebody says, you're gonna have a heart attack if you don't cut back on work, and the person keeps working, or their spouse says, I can't take it anymore, I'm gonna divorce you over this, and the person would say, I'm not decreasing at all. So like, well then of course that was where you say, oh, that's like an addiction because it's directly harming their own health or the people. Whereas if it's not harming, that's the difference. So, whereas if somebody says, oh, I'm spending a ton of time on this, but nobody's being harmed by it, their health isn't being harmed, their own happiness is not being harmed, and others aren't being harmed, then you can't label something. Or I think it's not a correct label to say addiction if it's not harming, because addiction implies negative, right? So the negative implies that it has to be harming their health or somebody else's well-being.
But that's you putting that annotation to the word addiction, because like any word can have positive or negative. It's the way you see it.
Yeah, no,
Like
yeah,
when
that's true.
when you talk about, let's take a word as, I don't know, manipulative, right? It could be a good and
Oh
a
yeah,
bad thing.
yeah, I agree.
Addiction. It could be a good, if you're addicted to helping others, it could be a good thing. You know what I'm saying? So,
Yeah, and I was using the word as a I was using the word particularly from a like there's actually I was really using, and that the way I was using it right then was from the psychological literature on like things like substance abuse addiction or process addictions, like whether it be when they're defining it like alcohol addiction or drug addiction or like gambling addiction, something like that. That's where they have this idea of it has to be harming. So it's very specific to that. That's like a diagnosis. Whereas because if somebody says, oh, like I agree, there could be other uses of the word, but I was saying like where it's pathological in the sense of a diagnosis, then it has to be harming. So that's what I was just saying, only in that context where it would be like a diagnostic label of something negative, that then has to be harming somebody. But yeah, you're right. Somebody could say that. you know.
I mean, there are addictions, new addictions like iPhone addictions, like for teenagers.
Oh, video game addiction, yeah.
So
And there is a diagnosis, like video game addiction, for example, it would be, but again, it's the same thing, like, there is, if let's say a teenager's flunking school and their
Yeah.
parents are freaking out, they would say, well, that's an addiction because it's causing harm.
yeah, so the NPR had something on it which said like if you go to bed with iPhone and then when you wake up you need your iPhone, then you're certainly addicted to it. That's funny.
Any other things about joyous effort? So I'll say a little bit, now it's the next one, right, of the 6 perfections, the next perfection is concentration, the perfection of concentration. And just I'll say a couple, maybe I'll describe that. So the way Lama Tsongkhapa is going to do this in the text now is he's going to pretty briefly cover the perfection of concentration and the perfection of wisdom. The reason he's going to do it pretty briefly is that he's going to cover them because the perfection of concentration and the perfection of wisdom are kind of broad topics. So he's going to describe what's the broad topic of those. But then the main emphasis of concentration is developing calm abiding and meditation. And the main emphasis, there's many kinds of wisdom, but the main kind of wisdom we're talking about is the wisdom understanding emptiness. And so he's going to go into, so he's going to cover them briefly in a kind of broad strokes, what are they in general, and then he's going to go for, I don't know, like 100 pages or more into the details. And so that's the next chapter. So we're going to just cover the overview here, or the kind of general point, and then we're going to go into humongous detail about the nature of calm abiding and the nature of special insight into emptiness, which is probably the longest single section of this text, and the most philosophically profound. But that'll come starting in March, I think, or April, depending on how quickly.
All of them are like that. The last chapter is the longest.
The last 2 chapters are quite long here, yeah. These are really detailed, about emptiness especially. He does a very detailed presentation. But okay, so we'll cover the concentration briefly then. So he says the entity, right, meaning what is concentration? So so he says the entity of concentration is a mind that abides single-pointedly on any suitable virtuous object. Right? So he's making a couple points. One is abides single-pointedly, right? So it's focused, right? And then he says on any suitable virtuous object. And that's interesting. I'll just make a point about that. That was in the commentary by a Lama, one of the Tibetan Lamas about this. Is Lama Tsongkhapa here is defining concentration as on a virtue. The object of concentration, what you're focusing on, has to be a virtuous object, the way he's defining it. One Lama points out, of course, some meditations are not on a virtuous object; they're on a neutral object. You know, so the point being, let's say virtuous object mean if you're meditating on love, right? You generate your mind into the entity or the nature of love, and then you dwell in that. Well, that's of course a virtuous object, right? Or if you're meditating on compassion, you generate your mind as compassion, and then you focus your mind, you try to remain focused in that state. That's a virtuous object, right? Then there's another kind of meditation where it's not you generate your mind into the aspect of it, but you kind of create a mental image. That would be where, like, if you visualize the Buddha, and then you focus on that image of the Buddha, right? So there you're not, like one is love, right, where your actually mind is feeling love, and then you dwell within that feeling. Another is where it's like more like a mental image, and then you're holding that mental image, right? It could be of the Buddha, it could be of Kara, you know. So that's another kind of meditation. Then there's another kind of meditation where it's not a visualized object as much as an insight. Does that make sense? So another kind of virtuous object would be if you meditate on impermanence, for example, until you recognize experientially, wow, everything about my experience is impermanent. My body is impermanent, my mind is impermanent. And you develop a kind of experience of that, right? A recognition, an insight into the impermanence. And then you keep your mind focused single-pointedly on that insight. That's another type of meditation on a virtuous object. So those are like, I'm just giving 3 different types of meditations on virtuous objects. But then, there are also meditations on neutral objects, like the breath. We did it today, right? So if you're meditating on your breath, that's actually a neutral object, right? It's not particularly virtuous, it's just your breath, right? It's not like love or compassion, it's just a physical sensation, right? And sometimes in some teachings, they'll do meditations on virtuous objects, but then on neutral objects, like they'll have somebody meditate on a stone, looking at a stone, for example. And it's just an exercise to develop their concentration. Does that make sense? So it's just an interesting point. Like there are different most meditation techniques are focused on virtuous objects, but there are some meditation techniques like the breath or a stone or something where you're meditating on a neutral object. The way Lama Tsongkhapa defines it here, though, the perfection. So because here he's getting at what is the perfection, the 6 perfections, right? So what's the perfection of concentration? He's saying the perfection of concentration is meditating single-pointedly on a virtuous object. Okay, so I'm just making that point. Does that make sense? So that when you're meditating on, say, the breath, you're developing your concentration, but it's not yet the perfection of concentration, according to Lama Tsongkhapa's definition. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So it's just it's a distinction, but it's a real one because we do meditate on our breath sometimes. And that's why, though, in the Tibetan tradition, they would say meditation on the breath is good, right? But it's mainly to calm the mind down, and then you use that calm mind to meditate on loving kindness or compassion or the Buddha or some other topic, because it's not yet perfection of concentration when you do that. It's just developing concentration, which is helpful, but not yet actual Dharma practice. Then he says, he gives, now he gives subdivisions of concentration. And so he says, in terms of entity, there are 2, mundane and supramundane. And so mundane concentrations are concentrations, let's just say it. Easier to say it this way. A supramundane concentration is meditation, realizing emptiness. So other concentrations are mundane compared to that. In terms of class, there are 3 types of concentration. Here you're just giving subdivisions so you know what they are. You don't have to memorize all these or anything like that. But one class is calm abiding, which we're going to get into in great detail. It's a certain state of meditation where the person has achieved a very advanced level of concentration, you could say, where their mind can abide on any object as long as they want without wavering slightly. And they experience a kind of bliss and flexibility where they can focus their mind. A person who has calm abiding, we'll get into it again, the next section of the text is going to cover it in a lot of detail, but a person who has developed calm abiding, they have this ability where whenever they want to focus their mind on an object, they can focus on that object for as long as they want with no distractions. And their mind doesn't get dull, and it doesn't get distracted. It just stays on the object for as long as they want it to. So it's a quite advanced state, but that's one class. Another class of concentration he mentions is special insight. And there are different kinds of special insight. The most important one is special insight into the nature of reality, meaning emptiness, but there are other types of special insight also. And so he's saying, where one meditates on an insight, a special insight is another kind of concentration. And the third class is the union of those 2. Right, so where there's this union of calm abiding and special insight in one moment of experience, or in the same period of experience. And that's a very positive thing to achieve. And we'll get into more detail about that later too. So those are 3 classes of concentration. And then he says, and again, these are just categories, but then he says, when divided in terms of the functions, then he says, there's the concentration that causes one to abide in physical and mental happiness in this life. There's the concentration that manifestly accomplishes positive qualities, and the concentration that brings about the welfare of other sentient beings. And then he goes on to explain those 3. So he says, the concentration that causes one to abide in mental and physical happiness in this life is a concentration that generates physical and mental pliancy as one places the mind in meditative equipoise. And what that means, actually, I'll just describe that very briefly. We'll go into more detail in the next section, but as on the calm abiding. But what that's getting at is this, as you begin developing your concentration, right, if you're training in your mind to concentrate in meditation, actually one way to explain it is this, is when you get to that 9th level, which is the actual calm abiding, actually calm abiding is after the 9th level, but when you achieve calm abiding, there's this experience, they say, both physically and mentally, of physical experience and also a mental experience of extreme bliss and what they call pliancy, which is it's almost like what he said, like a cotton. Your mind is very light and body is very light, and they're very suitable. They're pliable. You can engage in whatever you want. You don't get sort of, like we are ordinarily. If you do something for a while, or if you do something stressful, your body starts to feel heavy, and your mind feels kind of weighed down. Such a person doesn't have that anymore. Their mind is always light and it's always sort of flexible and always suitable to doing what they want it to do. The point here, I think, in part is this, is that that's a very advanced level of that, but even as we begin progressing in our concentration, we start having lesser experiences of that. I think it's from, if I remember right, I think it's from the third level of concentration on, you start to develop little bits of sort of pleasure. You know, it wouldn't be bliss at that point, but kind of pleasant experience in meditation, and a kind of physical lightness and physical well-being from meditation. And that gets more as you progress through the subsequent, there are like 9 levels described, 9 levels in the sense that you become better and better at concentrating your mind, and not getting dull, and not sinking, and not getting excited, but sort of being able to abide in concentration. And as you progress on those, you develop more and more this sense of physical well-being that eventually becomes a kind of blissful state, and of a mental well-being that becomes a kind of pleasant state of mind, and so on, and flexibility. And so what it's getting at is, as you experience those, that's concentration that develops physical and mental pliancy in this life, that benefits you in this life because it feels good. Does that make sense? And it gives you an ability to do more, to use your mind and body in pleasant ways. So that benefits you in this life, he's saying. Then he says, the concentration that manifestly accomplishes positive qualities. This is a concentration that accomplishes positive qualities shared with hearers, such as clairvoyance, complete liberations, totalities, and masteries. And so there what he's getting at is at very advanced, he's really getting at not something that we experience ordinarily. I mean, in ordinary meditations. So it's beyond this life. And that, like the first category was things that we all can, the first category was things that all of us who develop some degree of concentration begin experiencing in this life. This other one you can experience in this life, but it's quite advanced, so in other words, we may not succeed. Because it's things like clairvoyance. So what he's getting at is, after you've achieved very advanced levels of concentration, and particularly after you've achieved calm abiding, based on calm abiding, people can generate, actually anybody who's achieved calm abiding, if they do certain meditation techniques with that mind of calm abiding, can achieve clairvoyance. They say it's just normal. Actually, Buddhist and Hindu texts agree on this. They both noted that if you achieve calm abiding and you use it in certain ways, you can achieve clairvoyance, for example. That's only for people who've already achieved calm abiding. But at that level, you achieve these, so when he says positive qualities, he's meaning advanced positive qualities like that, and a mind of clairvoyance, or complete liberations, right? So that would mean like where you're uprooting, what's it say, right? Where you're seeing emptiness and therefore uprooting the mental afflictions and so on. That you can achieve those kind of advanced states through concentration, is what he's saying. And you can achieve those whether it's in this life or a future life, but you first have to have achieved an advanced level of concentration to experience this second class. Sorry. Go ahead.
Dr. Lauren, what is control over colors, like totalities and masteries, control over forms and objects? What does that mean? Like, when
Where does it say?
you have clairvoyance, you have
On the
complete
footnote.
liberations,
It's the footnote.
totalities,
Oh, down here, I see.
and masteries. So I looked at the footnote. It says control over colors and elements in the totalities, and over forms and other objects in the masteries. I don't know. Never heard those.
I'm trying to think, yeah, because let's see. The clairvoyances are the 6 clairvoyances of the 6
Yeah.
senses. The complete liberations are here from the various realms. So that would be like, I'll have to look the other ones up though, the totalities and the masteries. Forms and other objects of the masteries. I'll have to look that up. I don't remember.
That would be something like making a rainbow that we have heard about. I'm just debating loud here.
Yeah, I don't want to guess. I would have to look. I know that's taught in the Abhisamaya Alamkara by Maitreya, and also I think it's also in the Jamagavatara, but I don't remember right now what the definitions of them are. But I can look it up. It's in those texts, so I can look it up. Or you can look it up too, but I'll look it up for next time. Because I don't remember off the top of my head. It's taught in those texts what those are, but I didn't...
Well, I was thinking loud, like we have heard about this, when a guru comes, you throw a rainbow or something
Right.
happens. I think the control over colors, does that connotate to that or not?
It may be. I mean, because one can perform... People with clairvoyance... people with calm abiding can do things like... It's funny, there are Buddhist teachings that say, once you've achieved calm abiding, you can do things like walk through walls or walk on water, or there are these, so maybe that, there are teachings on that, and the teaching, it's just a side of it. They say, actually it's an interesting point, that what they say is, for somebody who's achieved calm abiding, those kind of, they're miraculous powers actually, are just normal side effects. They're not considered anything that important, in a way. But like, you know, like, so for example, they say like you can walk through walls if you've achieved calm abiding and you have a certain kind of concentration that you can walk through a solid object. But there's some idea of like, well, so what? Like that doesn't give you, they actually make a point. After you die, when you're in a bardo and you're a ghost, you can go through solid objects too. But that doesn't give you enlightenment. So the point is like, that's not that important. The clairvoyances are more important because they actually help you help others. That is the idea. Whereas if you could read somebody's mind, you can teach them more effectively.
Right.
But these other miraculous powers are considered not that significant or important or something like that. But I think it's among those. But I just don't remember which quality, which character. But yeah, there's this teaching on once you've achieved calm abiding, there are these things like, actually it's a text where it says, for somebody who's achieved calm abiding, if you do this meditation, then you can walk on water, and if you do this meditation, you can swim in earth. You know, like if you do this meditation, you can walk through a solid wall. And there are actual teachings on that in the text, and that must be in those categories, but I can't remember which category is which. Like it's in the text where it actually describes that.
You can fly.
Yeah, you can fly. Milarepa flew around, right? Like,
Yeah.
but again, then they say, well, birds can fly too. So, you know, that in and of itself is not
Yeah.
important in a sense, but it is a sign of having achieved calm abiding, because you can't do that until you achieve calm abiding, those qualities. And then the last one, the concentration that brings about the welfare of sentient beings, he says, this is a concentration that accomplishes the welfare in 11 ways by means of concentration. And actually that I did look up in the text. There's a list of 11 different ways of benefiting others. There are things like actions alleviating the suffering of sentient beings, actions eliminating the confusion with methods, actions benefiting sentient beings, action giving fearlessness to those who are afraid, action of giving comfort to those who are tormented by sorrow, and so on. So there's a list of 11 different ways that bodhisattvas who have achieved meditative concentration sort of manifest to benefit others through their concentration. Then he says, the thoughts regarding, so he says, how to generate concentration in one continuum. And we're going to go into a lot of detail about this, so this is why he covers this briefly here. I guess one point I'll make is this, is in the context of the 6 perfections, you know, any concentration on virtue, right? I mean, he said single-pointed concentration on virtue. So you don't have to have calm abiding. In other words, if you're cultivating generosity, for example, and you sit down and you meditate single-pointedly on, you know, the benefits of generosity and how wonderful generosity is, or if you meditate on love, right, which is a form of generosity, right, giving love. So if you sit down and you just meditate on love, on infinite love, single-pointedly, with bodhicitta motivation, that could be the perfection of concentration. Does that make sense? But that's not your calm abiding. Does that make sense? Because calm abiding is a very advanced level where you could, you know, this person, it can only be achieved when the person progresses through these different levels of concentration and eventually has this ability to focus their mind for as long as they want on any virtuous object they want to. So my point, I guess, is just this, is that concentration in general is a broad category, right? Any kind of concentration that's single-pointed is concentration. Then calm abiding is a very specific subcategory, a very advanced level of that. And we're going to get into calm abiding in detail later. But here he's saying, thoughts regarding the advantages of cultivating meditative concentration and the disadvantages of not cultivating it will be explained in the chapter on calm abiding. And so what he's getting at is, if you want to develop calm abiding, that takes a fair amount of effort. Because, you know, it's like you're really developing this incredibly focused mind, and that takes effort to do. And he's saying, if you're going to make that kind of effort, you first have to understand, why would I bother? Right? So you'll have to understand what are the faults of not having that kind of mind and what are the advantages of having it. And then you'll develop some appreciation for that kind of mind, and then maybe you'll want to achieve it. And he's saying, so I'm going to explain all about that in the next chapter, where I teach calm abiding. That's what he says here. And then again, he makes this point about, which you had asked about a few minutes ago, you integrate all 6 perfections into this perfection also. So he already said each perfection, he says that. So he says, you know, so he gives the example. He says, the generosity of training and concentration, possessing the 6 perfections, is to abide in concentration oneself and establish others in it, and the others are as before. So what he's saying there is like, so for example, if you were what's the perfection of generosity in relation to concentration? Well, first you have to develop concentration yourself, right? And then helping others develop it would be the generosity in relation to concentration. So once you have that experience, sharing that experience with others and helping them would be generosity. The others, he says, are as before, right? So, and actually, so for example, and we get into this earlier one time. Morality and ethics. One of the points in Buddhism is that if you're not moral and ethical, you won't be able to develop concentration. Actually, and that's because your mind. Actually, it's just true, right? Like in other words, if you, it's very simple, right? If you lie, right, and then you go try to meditate, what's going to happen, right? You're going to be thinking through. You're going to be going like, what if I get caught? Oh no! Now I have to remember. And when they ask me this, I better say that, or they'll, and you won't be able to calm your mind down to meditate because you'll be thinking about the lie you told. Or if you steal, right? Then when you go to meditate, you're gonna be thinking like, what if I get caught? Oh no! Like then you if you hear a siren, right? You go, oh no, that might be the police coming for me, and so on. So the point being, if you're not ethical, your mind will be preoccupied with the issues of your lack of ethics, and you won't be able to calm your mind down. And actually, I'll just say one point. Like, some friends have pointed this out to me. They even when they go, I had some friends who did meditation retreats, and they would point out that if they had done sometimes when they had done unethical things earlier in their life, even that then that they hadn't thought about recently, that when they tried to really settle their mind, then those images would come up and those thoughts would come up, and it would distract them from their meditation, and became an obstacle. Now that could be removed, but actually the Tibetan Buddhist advice would be, well, they have to pause the meditation and purify those negativities, and then go back and meditate, and you can do fine again. It's not like we've all done bad things at some point, and that's so. In other words, if having done bad things permanently stopped you from meditating, then of course nobody would ever be able to meditate deeply. But that temporarily can be an obstacle, and so one is we have to practice ethics if we want to meditate well, and the other is though if you want to really develop deeper meditation. That's why, sometimes they'll say, if somebody's going to do a retreat on calm abiding, where you go off and really try to develop very deep concentration, oftentimes Tibetan teachers will advise first doing purification practice, doing retreats first to purify, so that then when you go do the retreat on calm abiding, those things won't come up and distract you. You can bring them up first on purpose. That makes sense, in the right context, to purify them. So you would do a retreat first where you would sort of let all that come up, and purify it, and then you would do another retreat after that where you develop calm abiding, is sometimes a practical advice they give, because otherwise our conscience becomes an obstacle to concentration, and appropriately. In other words, it's good that those things come up because we have to purify them. But once you purify them, then it's easier to, and then if you stay ethical, your mind stays simple, not preoccupied, not worried, and then you can concentrate better.
It's called insight meditation, because
Which?
where things from the past show up.
Oh, in this concept would be shamatha. Actually, what they're talking about here is shamatha. So not yet, but Vipassana is next. That's insight, right? So insight's a form of wisdom. So this would be shamatha meditation.
Samatha, vipassana, that's what we call it in Sanskrit.
Because vipassana means insight, right?
It kind of gets, I don't know, in Nepal, the part that you're talking about, so they will have meditations where people will go for retreats for months.
Oh, they call it that.
A month, and so actually you come to realize you're 8 years old or 10 years old, something happened, and then you kind of connect back to it, because now your mind is calm enough to look at virtuous and non-virtuous acts that has been done in the past. Up until now, I was not able to see it, but I can now reflect back in the past.
Oh, so you're saying when people do retreat, that
Yeah,
experience?
they call it vipassana, and so
Oh, okay.
whatever the name.
Oh,
is.
certain groups that do retreats,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Gil. I interrupted.
No, that's fine. So it's not like you can't, because that kind of sounds a little bit, but I know that's not, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but, it's not a prerequisite to practice that concentration, to be, to have perfected ethics.
No, that's not the idea. Because if you think about really, in other words, they say that, for example, bodhisattvas on the third bhumi, right, become surpassing in their practice of ethics, right? They become, in other words, on the third bhumi, bodhisattvas become really very special in their ability to be ethical. But by definition, they've achieved calm abiding way before that, right? They achieve you have to have achieved calm abiding even long before the first movie, not
Right.
just the third. So it's not that. But the idea is just on a more, we're talking more like on a conventional level, right? Like, or is that because there are very subtle points of ethics that very advanced bodies, you have to be quite advanced on the path to become really good at.
Right.
What they're getting at, I think, here is like, things like the 10 non-virtues. In other words, if somebody's engaged in like criminal behavior,
Mhm.
if you're lying to your, if you're lying regularly at work or with your partner, or you're lying to people, if you're, whereas if you're not being sort of fundamentally an ethical person,
Mhm.
that it's going to be very hard to develop concentration, is the idea. And that, so they're talking about more like on almost like a grosser level.
Yeah.
I think that at first, in other words, if we're trying to develop our meditative concentration, in one sense, you could say that we have to live a pretty simple lifestyle,
Right.
and not sort of be, especially not engaging in,
Yeah.
things that are going to preoccupy our mind because
Yeah.
they're deceitful and.
Because I think I've heard of like the prerequisites for calm abiding, like it's to have little attachment.
Right.
Is that one of them too? Like, is that, or you're not there yet? You haven't gone
Oh, we'll get into details about that, all that stuff, but
Yeah.
really I'm getting at, like, actually in the teaching on the 3 higher trainings, for example, they emphasize this, that's where I was emphasizing it from. In the
Oh.
teaching on the 3 higher trainings, they say the training in higher discipline, or morality,
Uh-huh.
has to come before you have to, it's a foundation, they don't say before, they say it's like a foundation for the higher training in meditative concentration. So what they're saying there is like, if you're not being moral or ethical, that you don't have the foundation for developing concentration, because your mind will be, they're talking about like on a pretty gross level, that your mind will be so sort of caught up in drama, really, so they're talking about like that, like, and that is like, even if you're like, I think it's at a pretty simple level, like, if you're caught up, let's say, in an argument with somebody, right, like at work or at home or something, like a real, where you're really mad at them and they're mad at you and you're like arguing, and then you go try to concentrate in meditation, if you've had that experience, right, like, your mind is not going to be calm, or it's not going to be peaceful, right, it's going to be like, it's going to be a real struggle to get 5 minutes or 3 minutes or even 1 minute of abiding. If you say, okay, even if you try to focus on your breath, right, you'll focus on, like, I breathe in, I breathe out, oh, they said this, well, how could I, then like, oh wait, I breathe in, I breathe out, oh, how, I'm going to say that next time, and then they'll really show that, oh, you come back, and your mind will keep going back and forth, that's the harsh speech one, actually, right, like, if you think of the 10 non-virtues. And so, I think at this point, I was just getting at that kind of level of, that you have to have a kind of fundamental basis of morality, where you're not caught up in, because in a way, if you're living part of the point there, just I think very simply, is if you're living a kind of fundamentally ethical life, there's less drama, and then you have less that your mind is sort of having to obsess about. Then there's another point, actually the one of having few desires is actually another one, right, because if you have a lot of, and we'll get at that, one of the 2 main obstacles to meditative concentration is, here I think they translate it as mental excitement. But what they mean by mental excitement in the context of calm abiding is where the mind is so caught up in desire that it goes to another object. There was so like that are, because there are 2 main obstacles for meditative concentration. There's the 2 main obstacles. If you think of meditative concentration as in the middle, one obstacle is excitement, where your mind gets too caught up in desire that it jumps to another object. And if you're doing that, then you're not abiding, right? So having few desires is cutting off, in a way, the mental excitement, so that your mind can calm down in order to stay with whatever object, right? Because if you're like thinking, if while you're trying to meditate, you're thinking, oh, I'd really like this for dinner, and oh, I want to see that movie, and oh, I want like to have this experience, then you're not able to abide. The other main obstacle is what they call, I think in this text they call it laxity, but it's where your mind's too dull, or too, it's not vibrant enough. It's sort of, the extreme form of it is falling asleep, but there are subtle forms of it also where you're just not, your mind is kind of dull. So the extreme would be you lose the object because you're so tired that you sort of sleepy. But there are subtle levels of it where you're able to stay on the object, but it's like with a dullness that's not vivid. So it's not a kind of good meditation. But so anyway, in terms of few desires, that would be that if you have many desires, you'll have too much mental excitement, and you won't be able to stay with the object. So you have to decrease your craving, your the number, you know, the extent of your sort of minds of desire, where you're not sort of letting your, because otherwise your mind will keep jumping away. You know, so if you're trying to focus on an image of the Buddha, your mind will keep jumping to whatever, you know, whatever other objects.
Yeah. But you're right, that's getting into the actual karma binding.
Yeah.
Right. But this is like a foundation that you.
Yeah, so here he's just saying at the, I mean, and also you can see here, and actually that's the end of the section anyway on concentration. So you see, he covers it very briefly here,
Yeah.
because you know, in a few pages he's going to go into great detail about how to develop meditative concentration and calm abiding, and we'll cover that, and we'll go through that whole topic, which is a big topic. But actually, I guess we should stop there. But I'll just say, so you know, next class we'll cover the overview, the kind of general presentation of the perfection of wisdom. And then I'll just tell you guys, because, so we'll cover the perfection of wisdom, and then there's a brief section on, called the 4 means of gathering disciples. And actually, I'll just make a point about that, it's interesting. The 6 perfections are mainly to ripen yourself, he says. We often think if you think I'm practicing patience, ordinarily you think, that's so nice of me. I help other people so much by being patient with them. Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, actually, patience, for example, and generosity. If you're generous, you think, oh, I'm so generous, I'm helping others so much. Lama Tsongkhapa makes a funny point here. He basically says, the 6 perfections mainly help you, actually, to progress. In other words, they mainly ripen your mind. Does that make sense? They do help others indirectly, but the main benefit of the 6 perfections is they help you become enlightened so that you can help others more. They do help others peripherally. And then he says, it's the 4 means of gathering disciples that are the main thing that bodhisattvas on the path do to help others. So the 6 perfections, you know, and that way, when you become a Buddha, those beings will have a connection with you, and you'll lead them to enlightenment and so on. I think that's funny, because I think oftentimes we think, like, oh, look how nice I am to others, I'm being generous. Look how nice I am to others, I'm patient with them. And Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, basically, actually, that's helping you mostly. You're the main beneficiary of your own patience, you know, not others, which I think is ironic, because we sometimes misunderstand that. And so that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is, you know, that's in the structure of the way he's presenting it, that's his point there. Is if you become generous and patient and ethical, you're the main benefit. You benefit more than others do in that. And it helps you become enlightened. Does that make sense? But also it benefits you in the short run. You have better rebirths, for example, and you have more peace of mind and so on. And it's the 4 means of gathering disciples that are mainly how somebody who's not yet a Buddha benefits others. So we'll cover that, and then we have the long section where he really goes into a lot of detail on developing calm abiding, and then on the nature of emptiness. So that'll be interesting. So anyway, we should do the verse of dedication. 2 verses. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara